I'm Casey. I'm a missionary to Thailand. My family moved to Thailand in August of 2019, and we get a lot of questions. A lot of them are very similar in nature. So we thought that we would periodically post a little segment where we address some of those questions. And one of the most commonly asked questions that I've been asked over the couple of years that we've been here is, how did you end up in Thailand? How did you know that it was God that was calling you? And so that's what I'm going to talk about today, just briefly. It was July of 2018, and there was a man that came to our church, and he shared about how he had formed this ministry with his best friend, and they would go to these different cities across the world where there were these soccer matches, the World Cup. I'm not familiar with all of that, but and so they would, apparently human trafficking is a huge problem at these types of events. And so they would go and they would walk around the city, they would walk around the stadiums. Sometimes they were allowed into the stadiums, and they would walk and they would just pray that that evil would be broken, and pray for protection for these people. And I was really inspired by his story, and I was inspired to start prayer walking around our house. And so that's what I did. I would get up early in the mornings, and I would I wore a path in the grass. By the time we sold our house to move to Thailand, there was a path worn around our house from where I was doing this prayer walking. And it was an experience that I had with God that was deeper than what I had ever experienced before. And so about a month and a half later, in September of 2018, John and Natalie Wood came to our church, and they were sharing about the need in Asia. And I sat in those pews. It was a series of meetings, and I sat there and I listened, and I felt nothing. And I felt ashamed of feeling nothing. And so by the final meeting, I was sitting there still feeling nothing, hearing about these people across the world who were having no opportunity or very little opportunity to hear who God even was. And I was numb to it, and it bothered me. And so in the final meeting, I was sitting there, and I suddenly sensed that God was saying, "I'm calling you." And it's a really bizarre concept to me, because I was never drawn to the idea of foreign missions. But so my husband was also at the meeting, but we drove home in two separate cars. We got home and we passed in the living room. And as we passed, I said to him, "I think God's calling us." And very typical for Robbie, he's a man of few words in most cases. He just said, "Okay." And so that's sort of how it started. There was a vision trip planned. John and Natalie were they were planning to take some people across to Asia. So we wanted confirmation that this idea was from God and not something that we had conjured up ourselves. And there was a vision trip that John and Natalie were planning to go to Asia in November of 2018. And so we decided to use that as a prayer fleece, that if God could make it possible for Robbie to take part in this vision trip, that we would take that as an indication that we were to move forward with the preparations to get our family to Thailand. And we very quickly were drawn to Sukhothai, because John had shared with us this burden that he and Natalie had had on their hearts for about a year, and they had been praying for the city, and there still had been no missionary that had entered. And so we quickly kind of latched on to that city in our minds. But Robbie being able to participate in this vision trip seemed like an impossibility, because he was a firefighter, and being able to get that many days off, he had no vacation time, and being able to get that many days covered with what they called shift swaps seemed like there was no way that was going to happen. On top of that, he would need the money to make the trip. So we decided if this was God, then God was going to have to do some really incredible things to get us to Thailand anyway. So we would put this out there and ask God to do the impossible. So we asked him, we were going to say nothing to anybody about the need for the money, and we asked him that he would provide the money and shift swaps for Robbie for all of his shifts within 24 hours. And something that is important to note about these shift swaps is that, at least at this time, whenever Robbie needed one shift covered, he would send out an email, and oftentimes he would have to send a second one in order to get somebody to respond. And in this case, he needed, I believe it was like 10. And so to get that, all 10 of those shifts covered within an 24-hour period just was not realistic. but we knew that that prayer fleece needed to be something that was not going to be easily answered, and so that's what we prayed. And so we sent out the email that night. By the time we woke up in the morning, a friend messaged us letting us know that if Robbie wanted to go on this vision trip, that he would cover the cost of it. And this was after having said nothing about it, and so we knew that we had at least part of that prayer answered. But then by about the 20-hour mark, Robbie had every single one of his shifts covered. And then around the 23, 24-hour mark, he also had administrative approval, which is not even something that we had asked for. Normally that would take a little bit of time beyond getting the shift covered to get the administration to sign off on it. And so we knew very clearly that God was in this thing and that it was God that was leading us. And that was such a blessing over the following months. I think it was 10 or 11 months that we spent preparing to leave. And it is not an easy thing to move a family of 10. 7 of us moved over here. But just everything that went into that, selling a house, dealing with a vehicle that was not paid off, working through what that was going to look like, leaving 3 adult sons, very young adult sons in America, sort of navigating all of the emotions that our teenage daughters were dealing with, and being able to look back and recognize that God had answered so clearly. This prayer that felt impossible was enough to give us the courage every time things got really difficult. And so that is the short story of how we ended up in Sukhothai. Not remarkable like some people. There was no skywriting or loud voice telling us that God was calling us, and yet we just had a very, very strong sense. And then as we prayed that God would make clear when it was from Him, He kept opening the doors. And so here we are. We've been here for 3 years, and God has made it clear over and over again that we are where we're supposed to be. So anyway, we will see you next time, where we will answer another commonly asked question.